In the end, this was a peace built on sand. It was a castle constructed on very weak foundations. For one of the elemental requirements of a durable peace, as everybody foresaw, was the rebuilding of the global economy. What had happened was that many people fastened on the idea of restoring the economic status quo ante. That is, the economic world as it had existed in 1914, and so appeared to be such a source of prosperity around the globe. The conviction was that restoring the Victorian boom was a condition for the political peace. Now, it was a not unreasonable assumption. In the wake of the war, people looking for new coordinates began to be nostalgic for the old world. And in the end, it was the great crash of 1929 that would heighten the tensions within Europe, that would bring the peace down. But in 1919, the big question was how to rebuild. If Wilson and Lenin were looking forward, these utopian visions of a new political peace, economists and business people, they were looking backwards. They were trying to restore an old order. And it was really this that invited the criticism, the invective, by John Maynard Keynes. Here we have an image of Keynes himself with his wife, the Russian ballerina, Lydia Lopakova. Keynes argued not just in his pamphlet, The Economic Consequences of Peace, but in many articles thereafter, that the Allies had made some fundamental mistakes in negotiating the treaties. One was demanding the Germans pay far too much in indemnity payments to the victors, that these payments were going to be, I hesitate to say this, but not unlike the requirements that Greece make payments nowadays, simply too onerous to pay, and will themselves become grievances that become the making elements of a future conflict. Keynes said, do not sow the seeds of future conflict even as you're negotiating peace. And he blasted the British Treasury for their old hat beliefs in, for instance, the gold standard. The fact was that the British economy of 1919 was not the British economy of 1900. It could not sustain the gold standard. And indeed, what was required was a new economic zeitgeist. For instance, flexible foreign exchange rates, capital controls that would control the flows of money across borders so that there wouldn't be runs on banks and pressures on currency that would force governments to resort to nationalistic economic policies to allow the economies to fully rebuild. Nobody, or at least among the statesmen, they were not listening to Keynes. They went back to their old belief systems. And the result was forcing the world economy into a deep recession from which there was no real recovery until 1921, which of course drove Keynes crazy. All of this economic orthodoxy in creating a recession in order to restabilize market forces only deepened the social unrest that governments were forced to contain. It was a perverse cycle. Keynes and others observing it just saying, this is lunacy. And he watched in dismay at what he saw as the folly of the ruling classes who wanted to return to the good old days. Those, of course, as far as he was concerned, had been gassed away on the battlefields of Flanders. But in the end, the crisis finally came. But it didn't come without a pause for a little bit of recovery. There was a moment in the 1920s where there was a brief recovery from what was much more congenital crisis. But it had less to do with the gold standard. It had less to do with the gold standard that had been restored, and it had much more to do with massive American lending to Europe. In the 1920s, the value of gross external assets held by Americans abroad, especially in Europe, rose by 400%. This flow of capital from the victor, the biggest single victor from the First World War, to Europe was very important for fueling the recovery. By 1928, the United States had loaned over $1 billion per annum. And the largest borrower was, not surprisingly, Germany, which was now making its indemnity payments to the other victors by borrowing money from the United States. It itself was now borrowing over $1 billion per annum. The difficulty in the ointment here was that the United States was what we call an immature lender. Britain, before the war, was a mature lender. Remember, enjoying trade deficits but exporting capital. That's how it kept the balance. An immature lender is one like the United States in the 1920s, or one might argue China now. You can hold that. That will be the subject of my last lecture. An immature lender is one that enjoys both trade surpluses and is an exporter of capital. Has a commodity surplus and exports capital. So that gold flows in. And the only way to keep the rest of the world that enjoys that has the status of the imbalance vis-a-vis the surpluses of the immature lender, the only way to keep the rest of the world expanding was to recirculate capital to foreign destinations to cover the world's trade deficits with the United States. I don't want you to get too bogged down in the technicalities of the economics here, except to note that this is a very vulnerable system. And we might ask ourselves, how vulnerable are we now with the current pattern of Chinese trade surpluses and therefore efflux of Chinese capital to support the disequilibrium of the world economy? It was very similar in the 1920s. So the 1920s was a boom, particularly the years from 1922 to 1927, but it rested on sand. And two factors would eventually bring it down. And both of them are related to capital markets. The first was that capital soon began to circulate back to the United States. This then revealed the chasm for the rest of the world, which was racking up big deficits, right? Especially for Germany, the big borrower, that was borrowing money in order to make the indemnity payments in order to sustain the peace. It had just licked the incredible hyperinflation of 1923. And here you have a famous image of the ways in which German currency had now become valueless, and restabilizing the German economy had required infusions of American capital. So scarcely had Germany recovered thanks to American investment, then it was soon hammered. German and Austrian banks began to crack, and they needed emergency loans from the United States. Along came hit number 2, which was the crash on Wall Street in 1929. It was the collision of two forces at the heart of the capitalist system that created a problem. It created a financial implosion. For the boom of the 1920s had rested on American lending. Now, as a result of the banking crisis in the center of Europe and the crack on Wall Street in 1929, capital was called back into the United States. Banks were recalling their loans. Remember, the system depended on the United States acting as a lender. Well, now those loans were being recalled. Or in some cases, the loans were failing altogether. All of this began the process then of bringing the rest of the financial system to its knees, culminating in Vienna with the failure of a bank called the Kreditanstalt This was an ancient bank created by the Rothschild family that spread a virus of bank failures across Central Europe and Germany. Governments by then, however, were too weak to rescue. These banks were, to put it in terms we use nowadays, too big to fail, but they failed. Capital flight set in, the panic spread, and the collapse of the Central European banking system rolled out. By 1931, almost everybody had defected from the gold standard that had supposed to be the anchorage for the post-war economy. In 1933, the United States joined the bandwagon, and the Great Depression was on, caused by the virus of a financial contagion. But there were some underlying causes I want to repeat. Part of it was policy, that economic decision makers relied on antiquated remedies, but part of it was structural. For the world economy had lost its core. The center of the system itself was too weak. And the response then to the effects of the Great Depression was to turn their backs on the key policy measures of the 19th century, which have been free trade, to allow commodities to move back and forth across borders, and a turn towards increasing protectionism. Competitive devaluations between states, rising tariffs, and kicking it all off was the United States, led by a couple of leading members of Congress, leading to the 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariff. Here are a couple of visionary congressmen, if there ever were some, which led to unprecedented hikes on tariffs slapped on to over 20,000 imported goods. Now, the economics profession rose up in upheaval. Seldom do we see so much unanimity among economists. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition to denounce this piece of legislation. Protectionism, though, only made things work. Between the collapse of the financial system, the cutting off of markets from each other meant the shrinkage in global trade. Indeed, global trade collapsed. For the 1920s, then, the world had barely begun to rebuild. Indeed, by 1928, world production had only reached 112% of its pre-war value. It had barely begun to reconstruct. But in 1932, trade in manufactures was only 16% of the value, 60% of the value it was in 1929. Dramatic decline in the circulation of manufactured goods. And of course, it meant that factories shut down. Since industrialists could no longer export their goods to other markets, the domestic markets were too small, industries shut down, and by 1932, 15 million workers in Europe were without a job. France was the hardest hit of all, and there was a general industrial collapse. Industrial output as a share of 1929 output was less than half of what it once was in the United States, Germany, Canada. The result was a destruction of the global system that had been built up over previous centuries. The greatest economic crisis in world history since 1500, with massive political consequences, as we will see in the next lecture.